everyone. Welcome to the Sentencing Project webinar today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jean Chung, and I'm the Program Associate at the Sentencing Project. It looks like we have about 80 people with us. I think we're going to wait maybe about a minute or two and then get started pretty quickly here. So thanks for sitting tight. Okay, I think we're about ready to get started. Welcome to our latest webinar in our Unlocking Justice webinar series. Today's webinar is on the changing racial dynamics of women's incarceration. Our presenter today is Marc Mauer, who is the Executive Director of the Sentencing Project. Marc is one of the country's leading experts on sentencing policy, race, and the criminal justice system. And he's directed programs on criminal justice policy reform for 30 years, the better part of which he spent with the Sentencing Project. When he's not busy testifying before Congress, being interviewed by journalists, or churning out new publications, including a graphic novel version of his book, Race to Incarcerate, which came out in 2013, he's also an avid soccer player. Today's webinar is on a study that Marc authored earlier this year looking at data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics to assess changes in the past 10 years affecting the prison population. What he found was a pretty dramatic shift in the racial composition of the U.S. prison population between 2000 and 2009, particularly among women. Marc will go over the major findings of the report and talk about some recommendations for policy and practice reforms to address racial disparities in incarceration. So we'll take questions at the end, but during the presentation, if you want to submit them via the questions bar on the right-hand side, feel free to do that. I'll be moderating that. But you will also have the opportunity to speak at the end and ask your question that way if you prefer that. So yeah, thanks, Marc. If you want to take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jean, and thanks to all of you for joining with us today as we talk about the findings in our policy report and what we believe some of the implications may be for policy and practice. What we'll be looking at today, here's an overview of what we want to try to cover. First, the growth of incarceration over the last 4 decades or so. Then the first decade of this century, where we began to see a slowing of the rate of growth. We'll talk a little bit about what factors have contributed to that decline. Then shifting to women's incarceration, first looking at the last 3 decades, then the changing racial dynamics we've seen over the last decade or so, trying to unpack what's contributing to those trends, particularly the changes in black women's incarceration, white women's incarceration, and then concluding discussing policy issues and recommendations for moving forward from here. So briefly, many of you know this story. Over the last 40 years, we've had a 600% increase in the number of people behind bars. The United States has become the world leader in its rate of incarceration. For purposes of comparison, we lock up our citizens at 5 to 8 times the rate of other industrialized nations. During this 4-decade period, the 1980s was by far the most substantial rise in use of imprisonment, increasing by as much as 12% in some years. And now we have a situation today, 2.2 million people behind bars in prison or jail on any given day. The slowing rate of growth begins in the first decade of the 21st century. For the 1990s, the median growth rate in the states was 71%, quite substantial. It continued to grow in the 2000s, but the median growth rate had declined to 21%. So not trivial, but a fairly significant shift from one decade to the next. During that decade of declining growth rate, 47 states experienced at least 1 year of decline in their prison populations. 5 states had an overall decline during that period: Delaware, Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, New York. New Jersey and New York stand out for declines approaching 25% over the decade. So very substantial changes that we're seeing there. Many of you know, too, in the last several years, California now, as a result of the Supreme Court order and other changes, approaching 20-25% reduction in its prison population as well. So what are the factors that are contributing to this slowing rate of growth? In part, this is a result of declining crime rates, although this factor is not as significant as one might think. Ordinarily, one would expect declining crime should lead to reduced prison populations, and yet most states have still continued to see their populations rise for much of the declining period in crime rates. But nonetheless, this is a factor, probably more so in some states than others. In some states, New York being one, it appears that changes in law enforcement practices, particularly on drug arrests, may be contributing some of the slowing of growth. Essentially, either fewer drug arrests or charging drug arrests as misdemeanors rather than felonies, with implications for how many people are subsequently sentenced to prison. A number of states now shifting their parole policies, especially for technical violations. Michigan and Kansas among some of the early states to do that. Many states now looking at creating graduated sanctions for parole violators so that they can avoid sending such high numbers back to prison for technical violations. Some states, such as New Jersey, employing more halfway houses, essentially halfway back to prison, again for parole violators, to try to reconfigure the conditions of parole supervision so that they can keep people on parole in the community and also avoid additional returns to prison. Finally, in some states as well, back-end reforms for persons in prison, rewarding merit time reductions for program participation, looking at good time, looking at parole release, basically offering incentives to participate in programming that one would hope would contribute to reduced rates of recidivism for people leaving prison. When we shift now to look at women's incarceration over the past 3 decades is where we see the very dramatic shifts. We go back to 1980, about 13,000 women in prison nationally, representing 4% of the entire prison population. Since that time, the country has added 100,000 additional women in prisons, state and federal prisons, nearly doubling the proportion of prisoners comprised of women, now up to 7% of the total. We look too at the growth rates over the last 30 years. Obviously, it's been very substantial overall for men as well, but the women's growth rate outpacing men's by roughly 50%. So women's growth rate 646%, men's 419% during this 30-year period. If we look in particular at drug offenses, going back to the mid-1980s when the drug war really took off with increased arrests and sentences for drug offenses, women have been more likely to be in prison for a drug offense than men of the people who are currently incarcerated. As the drug war took off, as the number of drug offenders in prison increased, that distinction between women and men kept pace to the point today where 1 of every 4 women in prison, at least in 2009, was incarcerated for drug offense. For men, roughly 1 of every 6, 17%. Women historically have been less likely to be sentenced to prison for a violent offense than men. So as the drug war expanded during those early decades and more people sentenced to prison for a drug offense, it was not surprising that women were more likely to see substantial rises in their composition in the prison system. Now, if we look here at the race and gender trends for the period 2000 to 2009, which is what we looked at in our study, these are the overall numbers here. You can see the red line at the top, the number of African American men in state prisons. We have a slight rise early in the decade, then a decline overall from 2009, a slight decline. The number of white men, the blue dots, rising during the decade, and the number of Hispanic men rising as well. Shifting to women, the trend is clearly more dramatic. The blue dots representing white women going up quite substantially during this 9-year period. Conversely, the number of black women declining substantially and number of Hispanic women rising during this time as well. If we translate this into rates, taking into account the population base for each of these, what we see for men, the rates become a decline for black men approaching 10% during this time. White male rates go up 8.5%. Hispanic males decline slightly. When we look at women's changes, though, it's really quite dramatic for, again, a relatively short period of time. So black women experience just over a 30% decline in their rates of incarceration, white women rising by 47%, Hispanic women by 23% during this time period. This then translates into changes in the disparities in incarceration. Essentially, what are the odds that a person of a given gender and race and ethnic group will be incarcerated compared to other groups? So if we look at the year 2000, the beginning of the period we're looking at, this is for women, black women basically incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white women, 6 to 1. By the end of that decade, that disparity had declined by slightly more than half. So black women were now 2.8 times as likely as white women to be incarcerated. For Hispanic women compared to non-Hispanic white women, the disparity ratio begins at a smaller rate, but we see a decline there as well, just not quite as severe. Now, these developments, I think, are intriguing, and we'll go into some of the factors on this. I think I would note that even at a black-white disparity ratio of roughly 3 to 1, this is hardly a trivial distinction in the rate of incarceration, very substantial developments here. And so it suggests, we should want to look at the various factors that contributed to these disparities. But nonetheless, the fact that the disparity ratio declined by essentially half over a 9-year period is a real shift from what we've seen, certainly in looking at the trends of recent decades. So how do we explain what's happening to these racial dynamics of women and changing during this 9-year period? Well, for a start, the numbers we're looking at, the rates, these are national figures, and it's quite likely that, we may have 50 different state stories or even local stories within a state. I think there's reason to believe the trends are generally going in a similar direction around the country, but it's quite likely that there's a good bit of variation in how this is played out around the country. Secondly, I think this is not necessarily the same story of change for white women and black women. In other words, it's not as if law enforcement officers have shifted attention from black communities to white communities, and therefore we see this racial shift in women. I think it's likely that we're seeing two different stories, one for white women, one for black women. I should say at this point, too, while we have national data on Latinas, and all the data in this report come from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, when we get down to analyzing what those trends look like in the next few slides, unfortunately we don't have sufficient data on Latinas to really reach any judgments about what's going on in that community. So the rest of the analysis looks at differences between black women and white women and what those trends have produced. So here we have a subset of 12 states where we have information on race, gender, and offense. These are 12 states where BJS has relatively complete data on these factors. These states come from around the country. We can't say to what extent they may be representative nationally of the prison population, but they give us at least some suggestion of what these trends may look like. If you look at the lines in bold, the total lines, what we see first for white women in the difference column is that there was an increase of about 6,600 additional white women in prison in these 12 states, and that's starting from a base of 14,000 or so, so a fairly significant rise for that period. Looking down at black women, here we see a decline of 1,800 black women incarcerated, starting from a base of about 17,000 at the beginning of the period. If we break that down and look at the offense categories, for white women, nearly half of the increase was a function of an increase in women incarcerated for a property offense. Of the remaining difference, roughly a quarter each was due to increased women serving sentences for violent offenses or drug offenses. I think we can note as well, of the people in prison for a property offense, a fair number of those often might be considered drug-related offenses. Somebody commits a property crime to obtain money to buy drugs to support a drug addiction, may be drug-related, and there's no way of putting a precise number on that, but that's part of what we want to keep in mind looking at this. When we look at the situation for black women, there the decline of 1,800 or so black women in these 12 states is almost entirely due to reduced numbers of people serving time for a drug offense. There was a relatively modest rise, 13% for people serving time in a violent offense, relatively modest decline, 20% for property offenses, but overwhelmingly the numbers in these states point to changes in people incarcerated for a drug offense. So what's happening here, starting first with white women, what do we know about drug offenses in particular as one part of the explanation? It appears that in a number of states, as drug law enforcement has shifted towards methamphetamine offenses, that this is probably contributing to higher rates of incarceration for white women. People arrested, charged with a meth offense, overwhelmingly are white or Latino, much less likely to be African American. Unfortunately, we don't have detailed data to break this down by drug. There's, selected information from some states that seems to suggest a rise in methamphetamine arrests in some states is probably contributing some portion to the changes we're seeing. Along with that, some of the same types of mandatory sentencing policies that have been adopted for other drugs in recent years have now been adopted for meth offenses. The federal system, particularly harsh in some states as well, also some relatively stiff sentences for methamphetamine, often requiring mandatory penalty time. When we look at incarceration for black women and the contribution of drug offenses, what we're seeing, it appears, is that just as the drug war, when it was ramping up, was disproportionately affecting African Americans and Latinos, now that we're at a point where some states are beginning to reduce their drug offender populations, it may be that African Americans and Latinos are disproportionately benefiting, in a sense, from those reductions. New York State, where we have fairly complete data, is probably the most extreme in this regard, or at least of the ones we know. There, the entire decline in the women's population during this period can be explained by a reduced number of people serving a drug sentence, and of that, virtually the entire drug offender decline consists of African Americans and Latinas. So a variety of changes in drug policy in New York State contributing to less incarceration of people from communities of color, now showing up in changes in the racial composition in the prison system in that state. Now, we also see around the same period some changing socioeconomic factors that are likely to be contributing to some of the changes we see among white women in particular. Most notably, recent research shows us that life expectancy at birth for less educated white women, defined as women who have not completed high school, life expectancy actually declined by 5 years from the period 1990 to 2008. Again, a fairly significant decline in a relatively short period of time. If we look at black women during this time period, less educated black women, there was actually a slight rise in life expectancy. So less educated women, white women's life expectancy declining significantly, black women's actually rising slightly. Researchers pointing to smoking and joblessness as key factors explaining the changes in life expectancy for white women. The idea, of course, that employment gives one a purpose in life, sense of community, and obviously financial resources to make it. Now, the changes in life expectancy and the various factors contributing to that, many of the risk factors we see there are also risk factors for involvement in crime, involvement in substance abuse, and the like. So as we're seeing these shifts in the population at large, seeing how the socioeconomic changes play out, we can see, I think, a mix of both criminal justice factors and socioeconomic factors coming together in many respects to contribute to the outcomes that we're seeing for white women's incarceration here. Now the question then becomes, if these trends are influencing white women, why are they not affecting black women in the same way? And again, black women who have not completed high school. I don't know that we know the full answer to that. It seems to me that would entail doing a lot of community studies on coping strategies and the like. One possible part of the explanation may be that in African American communities, severe social disadvantage is not a new phenomenon. This has been around for quite some time. It may be that coping mechanisms, communal supports, whether it be through family, religious institutions, other kinds of community organizations, may be able to play more of a role, have played more of a role historically in areas of concentrated disadvantage, and perhaps more so than we may see in white communities, and so less of a sort of community safety net, if we want to think of it that way. So that's one possible part of this explanation here. Finally, in terms of where we want to go from here, what are the implications of the research that we've done here? I think for a start, what we need to see, what would be very useful, is to try to replicate our national findings in the states. As I mentioned earlier, it's likely that we have 50 different pictures that may emerge. They may go in similar directions, but there's likely to be quite a bit of variation. So it would be very useful and policy relevant to try to conduct similar studies over a similar time period and see if these race, gender, ethnicity trends, how they play out in a given state. In particular, it seems that we'd want to know what this might suggest for moving forward from here. For African Americans, we've seen clearly in recent decades very dramatic rates, the world record rates of incarceration for men and for women. So a shift in the other direction suggests that we may have something to learn about how we could reverse, at least in part, some of the trends that we're seeing. And it would be very useful to see what we can learn from the study of those dynamics. Conversely, the rise in white female incarceration To what extent is this due to changes in drug law offending? To what extent is this socioeconomics? To what extent is this criminal justice processing issues? All those kinds of questions would be very useful to try to unpack some of this. A second recommendation is to follow the lead of several states that have established a statewide task force to look at racial disparity. Connecticut, Illinois, Wisconsin in recent years have done such analyses and have task forces looking at trends in their system, trying to understand where these come from, and having task forces in place that can try to develop strategies to reduce the scale of disparity in their states. And all three of these states have had very high rates of disparity that they've been very concerned about. So there are models for how to go about doing that, how to work with the academic community as a partner in data analysis, and the like. Other organizations have been trying to work on the ground at a jurisdiction level to work with practitioners to get at disparities in the court system, in the correction system, and the community level with law enforcement and the like. So the American Bar Association in recent years is now in the second round of a project where they're working with 4 jurisdictions around the country that have indicated they have disparities in their jurisdiction and wanted to put a team of practitioners together to try to unpack where that was coming from and how they could address those disparities, how they could change policy or practice in a way that's consistent with promoting public safety to move to a better position. In the Bay Area in California, the Hayward Burns Institute for some number of years now has been working with jurisdictions largely around juvenile justice disparities, but again, bringing in around the table key local practitioners, key community organizations to also try to look at a jurisdiction level where disparities come from and how they could be addressed, where disparities in many cases may be unwarranted, may be unintended, but by examining the data, by doing the analysis, practitioner decision-making can begin to look at ways to shift those dynamics. And then finally, is to look at the example in several states now of adopting legislation to permit a legislative body to have a racial impact statement done prior to adopting new sentencing legislation. The idea here is that similar to fiscal impact statements or environmental impact statements, it's much better for policymaking to anticipate or to project the consequences of a new policy before it's adopted rather than after the fact. So in criminal justice, one of the most obvious and extreme examples are the federal crack cocaine penalties adopted in 1986, charging crack offenses much more harshly than powder cocaine. Within a few years of their enactment, it was determined that more than 80% of the people prosecuted for the crack offense were African American. And these are dynamics and issues that were hardly addressed at all as the legislation raced through Congress. So the idea is, can we develop legislation that can promote public safety in a constructive way without exacerbating racial disparity? In 2008, Iowa and Connecticut became the first states to adopt such legislation. Earlier this year, Oregon became the third state to now adopt racial impact policy, and several other states are poised to introduce such legislation in the coming year. So let me close by saying these recommendations, this analysis, are by no means giving us the full picture of racial disparity in incarceration. We all know this is a very complicated question, but the changes that we're seeing in recent years suggest that we need to pay, I think, very close attention to how these factors are playing out. And again, the fact that African American rates of incarceration are declining even somewhat suggests to us that there are policies and practices that we can employ that should be able to reduce the disastrously high levels of incarceration we've seen for several decades, and obviously, too, when we look at the increase for white women, I think we should be troubled by the rises that we're seeing and investigate whether there are ways to deal with those trends that ultimately can provide cost-effective, compassionate, and non-biased outcomes throughout the criminal justice system. So let me close the sort of formal presentation now, and I think Jean will probably be fielding some questions, and please feel free to type in your questions if you have other issues you'd like to address. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. We do already have several questions queued up that people have typed in. If you have any questions that you would prefer to ask over the phone or by audio, you can click the blue button that has a hand on it on the right-hand side of your screen to raise your hand, and then we can get to you that way. But to start off, just a quick clarifying question from Lisa Burke. Was this study limited to women age 18 and over, or what were the age parameters?
Yeah, these are women in state prisons, so essentially virtually all of them, in the adult criminal justice system.
Okay, and then as a follow-up to that from Carol, do you have any insights you can share about these trends among juveniles?
No, we don't. We didn't look at changes in juvenile confinement in this analysis. I think many people are aware that the rate of confinement for juvenile incarceration has actually been declining overall at a very substantial rate over the last decade or so. It seems like it would be quite useful. There may be other organizations that have started to unpack the race and ethnic changes that we see there, but in this particular study, we're only looking at the adult system.
Okay. There's a question from Sophia. For the growth between 1980 to 2010 for women's incarceration, is that primarily at the state or the federal level?
That's largely at the state level. Today, somewhere between 85–90% of all people in prison are in state prisons, and it's in the range of 10–15% typically in federal prisons. So the rise that we've seen over that 3-decade period has been overwhelmingly in state prisons. Although I should note in the last several years, as the state prison population nationally has stabilized or declined very modestly, the federal prison population continues to rise. I think in large part, this is an emphasis, a result of sort of ongoing impact of mandatory sentencing penalties in the federal system, which have been quite severe in many cases. It's sort of the states in many cases have taken the lead on reconsidering the use of incarceration much more so than federal legislators have in the last decade or so.
Great. It looks like Vivian Nixon has her hand raised, so let me unmute you, and then feel free to ask your question, Vivian. Vivian? Okay, maybe not. Maybe we'll try that again later. Lisa had another question for the drug offenses as a percentage of the prison population slide, the 1986 versus 2009. She says it appears that the rate of increase is the same, approximately 2.15. Is this a correct interpretation?
Yes, that is correct. So of the women in prison 1986, they were more likely than men to be incarcerated for a drug offense. But while the numbers and the rates for both women and men have increased, women in both 86 and 2009 have been about 50% more likely to be locked up for a drug offense than for men. So the disparity between men and women has not increased, but it's just as the overall numbers of drug offenders have risen, it becomes, in effect, more of an issue for women, even with the same disparity ratio for drug offenses.
Okay. We have a question from Oulu Buccola, who has a question about relating to the increases among white women's incarceration rates for violent, property, and drug offenses, particularly the drug offenses. Do those numbers take income or socioeconomic class into account?
No, they don't. These are just the increases overall in the 12 states for which we had data. So there's no easy way or obvious way to break those down. Clearly we do know that among prison populations overall, for both men and women and across racial groups, people admitted to prison are disproportionately low income from working class communities, lower levels of educational attainment or work experiences than the general population. But we don't have a more detailed breakdown of what that looks by race, ethnicity, or offense in particular.
Gotcha. You mentioned 12 states in which the incarceration rate for black women had a nearly total decline. What were those 12 states?
I can read them off quickly to you. They're California, Florida, Georgia, Missouri, Mississippi, New Jersey, New York, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Washington State. And again, these were the states where we're able to obtain data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, where the race and offense data were relatively complete. I should say, those of you who work with the BGS statisticians know they work very hard to get a very clear picture of what incarceration looks like, and often having to work with data that's more limited than we'd like to see. And so they always caution us that we can't necessarily take all the figures they produce as precise, but these are by far the best estimates that they are able to produce and that we then relied on. And they certainly suggest, a general direction of what's going on. But one should be just a little cautious about assuming they're, as precise as we might like in the best of all worlds.
Okay. You mentioned that black women may have benefited from a decrease in drug incarceration. So specifically regarding those 12 states, there's a question, was there any correlation between the use of drug courts or the efficacy of drug courts in those 12 states regarding the decline of imprisonment due to drug-related offenses?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's, I think, one of the number of issues that would really benefit from researchers looking at these states or others individually. And, my suggestion would be that to the extent we want to look at why the numbers of drug offenders may be going down or going down for certain racial ethnic groups, that we look at a range of factors, which might include law enforcement behavior and arrests. It might include prosecutorial charging practices. It could include drug courts and diversion from incarceration, sentencing policies. So a host of factors are likely to be at least part of the explanation in a given state, but we were not able to break that down at that level of detail in the analysis we did.
I see. Okay, it looks like we have a few questions from people who'd like to ask them over the phone. So I'm going to unmute Lynn Burke. Lynn, would you like to ask your question? Lynn? Okay. Let's try Carol Jean. Oh, Carol Jean has muted herself. It says you need to enter your PIN to unmute. Let's try going to Karen. Karen, you should be unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello. Hi, you can hear me. Hi, I was really interested in what you were saying. And you were talking about, when you were talking about the changing socioeconomics of women in America, and you were saying that the life expectancy for white women is decreasing, but that hasn't really happened for black women at the moment. And you were saying that you don't know the answer, but you think severe social disadvantage is not a new phenomenon for African Americans. So you seem to be suggesting that what we're getting is a kind of race to the bottom here, and that white women are kind of catching up to where, or catching down, if you like, to where black women were, 10, 15 years ago. Can you say something more about that, and whether also you're doing any research to either verify that or follow up on that hunch that you were talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is a good question. Yeah, there's certainly a strong argument one could make about a race to the bottom, however we might want to describe it. There are no shortages of studies in recent decades showing rising inequality over the last 30 years or so. And some people at the top have done very, very well, and the people at the bottom in many communities are doing even more poorly than before, perhaps. I should note, the research in socioeconomics, when we're talking about people who have not completed high school, this is in the range of 15% or so of the adult population in different groups. So it's not trivial by any means, but it's the most disadvantaged part of the population. We have not initiated a research project yet, although we're very interested in trying to think through how one could address this, what are the factors that might explain either racial differences in coping strategies or how growing inequality is affecting different racial ethnic groups. And I would hope that there are social scientists out there who'd be intrigued by this and would have something to offer in terms of a contribution towards explaining this. But again, I think it suggests that when we look at criminal justice, the various ripple effects that we see both going into and coming out of the system, that I think we've all learned that mass incarceration produces a host of collateral consequences, both for the people going through the system as well as their families and communities. And I think we're still exploring what that looks like, and it may take another generation to see the full impact. But we also, I think, can see that socioeconomic conditions, family structures, community structures can very much have an influence on involvement in crime or interaction with the justice system as well. And the sort of final piece of the puzzle there, or the connection, is that how we choose to respond to disorder, to behavioral problems in a given community is not preordained by any means. And the mix of approaches we choose to employ, to what extent we rely on the criminal justice system, promote public safety, to what extent this is a family or community problem, and if so, which institutions can be most effective. All of those decisions clearly have consequences, and we've policymakers have invested very heavily in criminal justice in recent decades. It's only now that we're beginning to see, I think, a serious reconsideration about what that overinvestment has produced, how we can achieve public safety more effectively, and certainly reducing much of the harm that's come from large-scale incarceration.
Great. We have a couple questions about Latina women. So first, to what do you attribute the dearth of available usable data on Latina women? Is there something we can be doing on the ground to improve access to better data?
Yeah. Well, I should say data on Latinos is certainly better today than it was 10 years ago and far better than it was 20 years ago. When the history in far too many correction systems was either confusion about whether Latinos should be categorized as a racial group or an ethnic group, or in some cases lack of interest or lack of prioritizing how to set up these kinds of categories. Again, the BJS, I think, has been doing quite a bit of work with state correction systems in recent years to try to standardize how data is collected on Latino populations in particular, and so I think that's led to significant improvements. But I think this also calls for people in individual states to sit down with their corrections officials and researchers to see if they are using the best methodologies that are available, to see whether the way of categorizing people is clearly understood within the organization and is consistent with what's considered to be best practices. So again, I think things are improving in this regard, but the quality of the availability of the data compared to blacks or whites is still lagging behind quite significantly.
Great. So regarding Latina women, have you examined immigration trends from 2000 to 2009, particularly in border states, to see if increased Latina immigration may impact incarceration rates? And has the increase of Latinas in prison with respect to their population growth at 23.3%, is that due to immigration offenses?
Yeah, well, we do know that the reason we look at both the numbers and the rates was to try to take into account the population changes. So the number of Latinas rose quite considerably during this period, but if we build in the calculation of the increased Latina population, then the rate increase is not quite as substantial, although it's hardly trivial at 23%. We don't have available data that would inform us as to who these women are. So we don't really have any way of knowing to what extent these are women who may have been in this country for many generations or relatively recent immigrants. And again, getting state-based data would be a very useful undertaking too, to see how immigration patterns, law enforcement patterns, sentencing policies may be affecting some of these trends. But clearly, with growing Latino population generally, many states are certainly seeing a rising Latino population. To what extent this is rising faster than the growth in the general population, we need to look around the country in different ways, but clearly a very significant issue for prison populations.
Okay. Sue asked, do you see a lag effect in the Midwest generally regarding declining incarceration rates and or with the shifting dynamics regarding race by race?
I'm sorry, say the beginning of that question, please.
Do you see a lag effect in the Midwest regarding declining incarceration rates and the shifting dynamics by race?
Oh, lag effect. I don't know that we've parceled that out completely. Many of the Midwest, upper Midwest states have had fairly high rates of black-white disparity for both men and women for quite some time. In some states, this is because of a very high black rate of incarceration, while in other states, the black rate of incarceration, while high, is more typical of what we see around the country, and the disparity ratio is frequently a function of the fact that there's a relatively low white rate of incarceration. So if we're comparing rates, the disparity ratio can come about in different ways. In general, we see the upper Midwest states, some of the New England states, have among the highest disparity ratios by race, black to white in particular. States in the Deep South have among the lowest disparity ratios, but again, that's in large part due to use of incarceration overall, whereas southern states historically have had much higher rates of incarceration. So African American rates are high, but also white rates are considerably higher than average as well. So it's a complicated story there, I think. I think there's Midwest states that are looking at these issues, and it really involves, taking a variety of factors into account to try to assess, where these high ratios come from and how they can begin to address this.
Okay, great. It looks like we have about a minute and a half left, so I'm just going to ask one more question. Let's see. You mentioned in your recommendations some efforts in states around racial impact and racial disparity. Is there any work being done in California to analyze women's racial disparities post-realignment?
That's a good question. I don't know the full answer to that. Clearly there's a host of researchers that are looking in realignment and its varied impacts. I would imagine that there's some of them out there who are concerned about what that looks like as the prison population declines and what does it mean for the jail populations and how we can look at this by race and ethnicity. But I don't know offhand which organizations may be doing that right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. I apologize that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but a recording of this webinar as well as the PowerPoint slides will be available on our website. We'll send an email out with the links to that, and Marc's report is also available on our website. And if you have any more questions, feel free to send us an email at staff@sentencingproject.org, and we'll make sure that they're answered. So thank you again for attending.